My best friend demanded 50% of my $12 million company sale for being my emotional support. So I offered her exactly what she gave me: nothing. Me and Haley had been best friends since middle school. We did everything together, survived high school drama, picked the same college, even lived together junior year. After graduation, she got a marketing job at a big firm making decent money while I waited tables and worked on my business idea at night. I was developing this app that connected local farmers with restaurants, cutting out distributors and saving both sides money. Haley would listen to me talk about it over wine, nodding while scrolling her phone. She'd say it sounded cool, then change the subject to her work drama or whatever guy she was dating. I spent 2 years building this thing, teaching myself to code from YouTube videos, cold calling farms at 5 in the morning before my lunch shift, begging restaurants to try the beta version. I lived on ramen and eggs, wore the same 3 outfits, skipped everything fun to save money for server costs. Haley would complain I was boring now and never wanted to go out. She'd invite me to expensive brunches, then act hurt when I ordered water and the cheapest appetizer. When I finally launched, I had 12 farms and 8 restaurants signed up. Small, but it was working. The app started getting attention from local food bloggers. A tech investor reached out after his wife saw an article. Within 6 months, I had funding and could quit waitressing. Haley threw me a congratulations dinner at her place, made a big toast about how proud she was, posted photos everywhere calling me her CEO best friend. The business exploded after that. 200 farms in 3 states, major restaurant chains signing contracts, features in industry magazines. I hired a team, got office space, started paying myself an actual salary. Haley would drop by the office during her lunch breaks, telling everyone how she'd been there from the beginning, how she'd supported me through everything. She started calling herself my unofficial advisor on social media. Then came the acquisition offer. A major tech company wanted to buy the platform for $12 million. Not life-changing money after investor payouts and taxes, but enough to set me up nice and fund my next venture. I told Haley at dinner, excited to share the news with my oldest friend. She congratulated me, we drank champagne, everything seemed normal. 2 days later, Haley showed up at my office with a man in a suit. She introduced him as her attorney and said they needed to discuss her equity stake before the sale went through. I laughed, thinking it was a weird joke. It wasn't. Haley sat across from my desk and explained that she'd been my emotional support system during the building phase, my sounding board, my unofficial consultant. She'd sacrificed nights out to listen to my problems, given me advice on logo colors, even helped me pick the company name during a drunk conversation I barely remembered. Her lawyer had paperwork showing she deserved 50% based on her contributions as a founding advisor. I asked if she was serious. She said best friends who build something together should share the success. I reminded her she had a full-time job the entire time while I worked 80-hour weeks. She said emotional labor was still labor. I asked what specific work she'd done for the company. She listened to me vent, encouraging me when I wanted to quit, and was present during my journey. Her lawyer actually nodded like this was legitimate. I told them both to get out. Haley started crying, saying I was choosing money over friendship, that she'd believed in me when no one else did. She posted everywhere that I'd betrayed her after everything she'd sacrificed to support my dream. Mutual friends started texting, asking why I was being so cold to Haley. Some said she had a point about emotional support being valuable. Her mom called my mom, saying I'd broken her daughter's heart. That's when I decided to give Haley exactly what she'd earned. I pulled every text exchange we'd had during those 2 years. Hundreds of messages where I'd share updates about the business, and she'd respond with K or cool before sending 20 texts about her dating life. Found the emails where I'd begged her to review my business plan, and she'd never opened the attachments. The voice memos where I'd asked for feedback, and she'd say she was too tired from real work to think about my hobby. I compiled it all into a document showing her actual contribution, which was 0. Then I calculated the fair market value of emotional support. Turns out therapists charge about $200 an hour. Haley had maybe listened to me talk about the business for 40 hours total over 2 years, being generous. $8,000 of emotional support if we're calling it professional services. I had my lawyer draft an offer. $8,000 for her contributions as an emotional support consultant, contingent on her signing away any future claims to the company. Sent it to her lawyer with my documentation of her actual involvement, which was nothing. Her lawyer called back, and what he said made me laugh. He actually laughed and said his client would accept the $8,000 plus an additional $2 million as a good faith settlement to avoid litigation. I told him to go ahead and file whatever lawsuit he wanted because I had receipts for days. He went quiet for a second, probably not expecting me to call his bluff, then said he'd be in touch and hung up. I sat at my desk staring at my phone, hands shaking from anger more than fear. $2 million on top of $8,000 for doing literally nothing. The nerve of it made my skin hot. My attorney called that evening sounding almost excited. She explained that Haley's legal position was so weak that any judge with half a brain would throw it out immediately. She said we should let them file so we could countersue for legal fees and harassment. The way she said it made me think she actually wanted this fight, like she was tired of seeing people get away with shakedown attempts disguised as friendship. I asked if this would mess up the acquisition, and she promised it wouldn't, said frivolous lawsuits happen all the time in business deals, and the acquiring company would understand. I wanted to believe her, but my stomach still felt tight. I spent the next 2 days going through 6 years of friendship with different eyes, seeing all the moments where Haley made everything about her. Every celebration of mine became her photo opportunity. My app launch party turned into her chance to network and hand out business cards. My first investor meeting that I was nervous about got 3 texts of support from her, followed by 40 texts about some guy who didn't text her back. Every struggle of mine became background noise to her dating drama or work complaints. I found old journal entries where I'd written about feeling alone even though I had a best friend, not understanding why I felt that way. Now I understood. She was never actually there. The mutual friend texts got worse. People I barely talked to anymore were suddenly messaging me demanding I just give her something to keep the peace. They said it wasn't worth losing a friendship over money, that I was being stubborn and cold. I started screenshotting every message where they put Haley's feelings over the fact that she was literally trying to steal millions from me. One girl I knew from college wrote this long text about how success changes people, and maybe I should remember where I came from. I wanted to write back that I came from waiting tables and eating ramen, not from Haley's couch, but I didn't. I just took the screenshot and added it to my growing collection of people showing their true colors. My tech investor called sounding worried about the acquisition timeline and whether this legal threat would mess up the sale. I told him my attorney said it was frivolous and wouldn't impact anything, trying to sound more confident than I felt. I could hear the concern in his voice, though, that careful tone people use when they're trying not to panic you, but they're definitely concerned. He asked if I needed anything, and I said no, just wanted to get through this and close the deal. After we hung up, I sat in my office wondering if Haley realized she wasn't just coming after me, she was potentially hurting my team and investors and everyone who actually helped build this company. Haley posted a long Instagram story about fake friends who forget where they came from and people who change when they get money. She didn't name me, but it was obvious. The whole thing was written like she was some victim of my success, like I'd betrayed her by not handing over half of everything I built. Within an hour, dozens of people who barely knew either of us were commenting their support for her. Heart emojis and comments about how she deserved better, how real friends stick together, how money reveals people's true nature. I watched the comments pile up feeling sick, seeing how easy it was for her to spin this story when most people didn't know the truth. I wanted to respond publicly so bad. I wanted to post all my documentation, every ignored text and unopened email, every time she made my business into background noise for her life. But I didn't. Instead, I sent my full documentation to the 5 friends I actually trusted, the ones who'd been there during the hard years and knew the real story. Their responses came back fast, shocked and angry on my behalf. One friend said she always thought Haley was self-centered, but never realized how bad it was. Another said she felt stupid for not seeing it sooner. Reading their messages made me feel less alone, like maybe I wasn't crazy for being mad about this. My mom called upset because Haley's mom wouldn't stop texting her about how I'd broken her daughter's heart over money. I had to walk my mom through the actual situation because Haley's version was apparently that we built the business together as equal partners. My mom kept saying she didn't understand how Haley could claim that when she had a full-time job the whole time. I explained about the lawyer and the 50% demand and the $2 million settlement counteroffer. My mom got quiet and then said she was proud of me for standing up for myself. She said she raised me to be fair, but also to not be a doormat, and giving away millions to someone who did nothing wasn't fair to anyone. My attorney sent a formal response to Haley's lawyer laying out exactly why his client had no legal claim. She included a detailed breakdown of my solo work building the company, with dates and documentation. Bank statements showing I paid all expenses. Server logs showing I did all the coding. Email chains with restaurants and farms that only had my name on them. Calendar records of my 80-hour work weeks. She added that we were prepared to pursue all available remedies if they proceeded with frivolous litigation, which I knew meant countersuing for legal fees and harassment. Reading the response made me feel powerful for the first time since this started, like I had proof of reality instead of just Haley's made-up story. 3 days later, Haley's lawyer filed a lawsuit anyway claiming breach of oral contract, unjust enrichment, and quantum meruit. My attorney was right that it was legally weak, but seeing my former best friend actually sue me still felt like getting punched. The filing came through email, and I sat reading these legal words that basically said I'd stolen from her, that I owed her millions, that our friendship meant I had to share everything I built. My hands were shaking holding my phone. Part of me kept thinking this couldn't be real, that Haley would come to her senses and drop it. But the lawsuit was real, and she wasn't backing down. The acquiring company's legal team called the next morning, and I spent 2 hours on a conference call explaining the entire situation. Their general counsel kept asking if there was any written agreement, any email where I promised equity, any documentation that might give weight to her claims. I walked them through my evidence folder showing hundreds of text messages where she barely responded to business updates, emails she never opened, voice memos where she said she was too tired to think about my hobby. The head lawyer sounded relieved by the end and told me to keep them updated, but this looked like a nuisance suit that wouldn't affect the acquisition. Still, I could hear the concern underneath his words, and knew they were worried about complications derailing their $12 million deal. My attorney called that afternoon to tell me she'd filed our response. She sounded almost excited as she explained that we weren't just denying the claims, but hitting back with a counterclaim for legal fees, abuse of process, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. She said we were going nuclear because people like Haley needed to learn there were consequences for trying to shake down their successful friends. The counterclaim laid out how Haley had a full-time marketing job during the entire period she claimed to be building my company, how she never contributed work product or business expertise, how she was now trying to extort millions through baseless legal threats. Reading through the filing made me feel powerful and scared at the same time, like I was crossing a line I couldn't uncross. But Haley had crossed that line first when she showed up with her lawyer demanding half my company. 3 weeks later, I sat in a conference room for my deposition with Haley's lawyer, asking me detailed questions about every conversation we'd ever had about the business. He wanted to know about the night she supposedly helped me pick the company name, about times she'd given me advice on marketing or strategy, about her emotional support during hard times. I answered honestly that most conversations about my business involved me talking while she scrolled her phone or changed the subject to her dating life. When he asked about specific advice she'd given, I explained that she'd occasionally said things sounded cool, but never offered concrete business input. I watched his face change as he realized his client had lied about her level of involvement, his questions getting shorter and less confident as the deposition went on. By the end, he was just going through the motions, and I could tell he knew he was representing someone trying to steal from their friend. My attorney called me the following week after Haley's deposition, sounding satisfied in a way that told me things had gone badly for the other side. She said Haley couldn't name a single specific contribution beyond being there and believing in me when pressed for concrete examples. When asked what work product she'd created for the company, Haley apparently said that emotional labor was work product. When asked how many hours she'd spent on business tasks, she couldn't give a number. When asked to describe her role in the company, she said she was the emotional support consultant and sounding board. My attorney said the court reporter was barely hiding her reactions, and Haley's own lawyer looked uncomfortable by the end. She told me we had everything we needed to get this dismissed, and probably win our counterclaim for fees. 2 mutual friends reached out to apologize after the legal filings became semi-public through the friend group. They admitted they'd only heard Haley's version where she made it sound like you'd built the business together as partners, and I'd cut her out when the money came. Seeing the actual legal documents where she claimed to be a founding advisor despite having a different full-time job the whole time made them realize how much she'd lied. One friend said she felt stupid for not questioning Haley's story more carefully, since everyone knew she'd been working at the marketing firm during those years. The other friend said she was horrified that Haley would actually sue me over something so obviously false and wondered what else Haley had lied about over the years. Their apologies felt good, but also made me sad that it took legal documents for people to believe me over her Victim Act. The judge scheduled a preliminary hearing 6 weeks out to address what the filing called the obviously frivolous nature of the claims. My attorney was confident we'd get most of it dismissed immediately since Haley had no evidence of any agreement or actual business contribution. But she warned me that even with a weak case, the process still meant months of my life consumed by this legal battle. Court dates and lawyer meetings and constant stress about what Haley might claim next. The acquisition was moving forward, but I had to disclose the lawsuit to the acquiring company and watch their lawyers get nervous about potential complications. Every day felt like carrying extra weight knowing my former best friend was actively trying to steal millions from me through the legal system. I threw myself into work to avoid thinking about the lawsuit, focusing on the acquisition transition and making sure my team was taken care of. I spent long hours documenting processes and training the acquiring company's staff on the platform systems. Several employees pulled me aside to say they were disgusted by what Haley was doing because they'd seen how hard I worked to build this company. One developer said he remembered me sleeping in the office during the early days, while Haley posted Instagram stories from fancy brunches. Another employee said she'd met Haley a few times when she stopped by the office and always thought it was weird how she acted like she was part of the company when she clearly worked somewhere else. Their support helped but couldn't completely erase the stress of knowing someone was trying to destroy what I'd built. Haley's social media campaign continued with vague posts about betrayal and people showing their true colors when money gets involved. She posted quotes about fake friends and loyalty and standing up for yourself against people who use you. I noticed she'd lost some followers but gained others who loved drama and left supportive comments without knowing the actual situation. The whole thing felt like she was performing victimhood for an audience, crafting a narrative where she was the wronged friend instead of someone trying to steal millions. Part of me wanted to respond and share my side publicly, but my attorney said that would only make things worse and feed into Haley's victim story. So I stayed quiet and watched her build this false narrative while I had legal documents proving the truth. My attorney discovered that Haley's lawyer was working on contingency after doing some research into his practice. That meant he only got paid if they won or settled, usually taking a third of whatever Haley received. She explained this was why he'd filed despite the weak case, since he was basically gambling that I'd settle to avoid hassle and legal fees. If he could scare me into paying even a few $100,000 to make it go away, he'd walk away with a nice chunk of money for minimal work. My attorney said these kinds of lawyers prey on successful people's desire to avoid drama and litigation costs. But we weren't settling because giving in would just encourage more people to try shaking down their friends with bogus lawsuits. The preliminary hearing finally arrived, and I sat in the courtroom watching the judge read through the filings, looking increasingly annoyed. He asked Haley's lawyer to explain what specific work product or business contribution his client provided to justify a claim for half the company. The lawyer's answer was rambling nonsense about emotional labor and friendship, and being present during the journey, and how modern business relationships include non-traditional contributions. The judge cut him off and asked for concrete examples of work performed, contracts signed, business decisions made, or intellectual property created. The lawyer stumbled through more vague language about support systems and belief and encouragement. I watched the judge's expression shift from annoyed to openly skeptical as he realized this lawsuit was exactly as frivolous as our filing claimed it was. The judge's voice cut through the courtroom silence like a knife. He dismissed the breach of contract claim first, stating there was no written agreement and no evidence that one ever existed. The quantum Merowit claim went next because Haley couldn't demonstrate any actual services she'd provided that had value to the business. I watched her lawyer's face go pale as the judge worked through each claim with clinical precision. Then came the part that made my stomach drop. The unjust enrichment claim would proceed because at this preliminary stage the court had to assume all of Haley's allegations were true. My attorney squeezed my arm and whispered that this was expected, that we'd kill it at summary judgment, but hearing the judge say one claim survived felt like losing. Walking out of the courthouse afterward, I saw Haley standing near the exit with her lawyer. She was facing away from me but turned when she heard the door open. Our eyes met for maybe 2 seconds before she looked down at her phone and walked quickly toward the parking lot. Something about that moment hit me harder than the hearing itself. She actually believed her own story. She'd convinced herself that listening to me talk about the business over wine made her a founding partner. The delusion was so complete that she'd hired a lawyer and filed a lawsuit based on nothing but her twisted version of our friendship. I stood there watching her disappear around a corner and realized I'd never really known her at all. My attorney filed the summary judgment motion 3 days later. She spent an entire afternoon walking me through the legal strategy, explaining that even if the court accepted every single thing Haley claimed as absolute truth, she still had no legal basis for recovery. Emotional support doesn't create business partnerships. Listening to someone talk doesn't entitle you to their profits. Being present during someone's journey doesn't give you ownership of their destination. Requested Reads is on Spotify now. Check out link in the description or comments. The motion was 50 pages of legal arguments backed by case law showing that friendship, no matter how Haley wanted to spin it, wasn't a contract. My attorney said we'd have a ruling within 60 days unless the judge was completely incompetent, and based on the preliminary hearing, she didn't think incompetence was the issue. The acquiring company's CEO called me 2 days after we filed the motion. I'd met him twice during negotiations, but this felt different, more personal. He told me he wasn't worried about the lawsuit affecting the deal because his legal team had reviewed everything and agreed it was nonsense. Then he shared something I hadn't expected. Years ago, when he'd sold his first company, a college friend had tried to claim he deserved equity because he'd let the CEO crash on his couch during the startup phase. The friend had actually hired a lawyer and sent threatening letters about how he'd provided housing and emotional support during the crucial early days. The CEO had learned the hard way that success brings out the worst in people who feel entitled to benefit from your work without doing any of the work themselves. He said watching me handle Haley with clear boundaries and documentation reminded him of what he wished he'd done differently. I started seeing a therapist the following week. My attorney had suggested it during one of our meetings, saying the legal battle was one thing, but processing the emotional damage was something else entirely. The therapist's office was in a building downtown with plants everywhere and soft music playing in the waiting room. I sat on her couch that first session and tried to explain how I felt about losing my oldest friend. She listened without interrupting while I talked about all the memories we'd shared, the inside jokes and late-night conversations and years of history that felt like they meant something. Then she asked me a question that changed everything. She wanted to know if I was mourning the friendship I'd actually had, or the friendship I'd believed I had. I realized I was grieving something that had never really existed. Haley's lawyer filed his response to our summary judgment motion 6 weeks later. My attorney called me laughing after she'd read it, saying it was the most unprofessional legal brief she'd seen in 15 years of practice. The whole thing was emotional arguments about the value of friendship and how modern business relationships include non-traditional contributions. He'd actually written a paragraph about how society undervalues emotional labor and women's contributions to male success, completely ignoring that I'm also a woman, and that emotional labor still isn't a legal basis for equity. My attorney said it read like a diary entry instead of legal argument, which probably meant they knew they were losing and had nothing else to work with. 4 of our mutual friends organized a dinner that week and specifically told me Haley wasn't invited. We met at a restaurant downtown, and I could feel the tension before anyone said anything. They apologized one by one for not seeing through Haley's victim act right away. One friend admitted she'd felt uncomfortable about Haley's social media posts even before the lawsuit, but hadn't wanted to get involved. Another said she'd been questioning other things about their friendship with Haley, remembering times when Haley had made everything about herself or twisted situations to play the victim. They'd all received messages from Haley asking them to talk to me, to convince me to settle, to remind me that friendship should matter more than money. Sitting there with these 4 people who'd actually stood by me felt like proof that I hadn't been crazy to fight back. My mom called that weekend with news that made me laugh out loud. Haley's mom had finally stopped texting after my mom sent her copies of the actual legal filings. Apparently reading what Haley had claimed in court, seeing it spelled out in legal language that she deserved half of a company she'd never worked for, had been too much even for her own mother. My mom said Haley's mom had responded with a short message saying she hadn't realized the full extent of what Haley was claiming and wouldn't be contacting us anymore. Even the woman who'd raised Haley and presumably wanted to support her daughter couldn't defend demanding half of someone else's company based on friendship alone. The judge's ruling on our summary judgment motion came down 8 weeks after we'd filed it. My attorney called me at work, and I could hear the smile in her voice before she said anything. The entire lawsuit was dismissed with prejudice, meaning Haley couldn't refile it. The judge had written in his order that emotional support between friends, regardless of how valuable it might be personally, does not create any legal obligation to share business proceeds. He went further and awarded us attorney's fees and costs, specifically stating the lawsuit was frivolous and without merit. My attorney said the language was unusually harsh, and probably meant the judge was annoyed that this case had wasted the court's time. I sat at my desk staring at the email with the court order attached, and felt something shift inside my chest. 2 days later, Haley's lawyer filed a notice of appeal. My attorney called it a delay tactic before I could even panic about it. She explained that the ruling was legally sound and we'd win the appeal easily, but it meant another few months of this dragging on while the appellate court reviewed everything and reached the same conclusion the trial judge had. I shifted my focus to the acquisition deal, pushing through the final paperwork and negotiations with the tech company. My attorney kept me updated on the appeal status, but she was confident it wouldn't affect anything. The acquiring company's legal team did one more review of everything, checking that the lawsuit dismissal was solid and final. Their CEO called me personally to say they were impressed by how I'd handled the whole situation. He told me most entrepreneurs would have panicked or settled just to make it go away, but I'd protected the business and stood my ground. The call made me feel like I'd done something right beyond just building a good product. Over the next 3 weeks, we finalized every detail of the sale. I met with my team to explain what would happen after the acquisition, making sure everyone knew their jobs were secure and the new company valued what we'd built. Several employees pulled me aside to say they were glad I hadn't let someone take credit for work they didn't do. One of my developers told me he'd watched me code at 3 a.m. during the early days, and he knew exactly how much I'd sacrificed to build this thing. The sale closed on a Tuesday morning in a conference room downtown. I signed what felt like 100 pages while lawyers from both sides witnessed everything. When it was done, the acquiring company's CEO shook my hand and welcomed me to their advisory board. I walked out of that building knowing I had $4 million coming after all the investor payouts and taxes were processed. It wasn't enough to retire at 30, but it was real money that I'd earned myself through years of work nobody else wanted to do. The wire transfer hit my account 3 days later, and I just stared at the number on my phone screen for a solid 5 minutes. $4,200,000. Money that represented every early morning farm call, every night teaching myself to code, every restaurant pitch, every server shift where I'd been too tired to stand. I'd built something real, and someone paid me real money for it, and not a single dollar of it belonged to anyone who hadn't actually worked for it. My attorney called that same afternoon with news about the appeal. She'd filed our motion to dismiss it as frivolous, and requested additional sanctions against Haley for wasting everyone's time with meritless litigation. She sounded almost excited when she explained that we were making an example of this case because too many people think they can sue friends over imaginary claims without facing any consequences. She said the appeals court had all our documentation showing Haley's complete lack of involvement, and the trial judge's ruling had been so clear that there was basically nothing for them to overturn. I asked how long the appeal process would take, and she estimated maybe a month before we'd hear something. I spent that month setting up my financial life properly for the first time ever. I met with a financial advisor, opened investment accounts, paid off the tiny amount of debt I still had from the early business days. I put money aside for taxes, set up retirement accounts, and actually started thinking about what I wanted to do next, instead of just surviving day to day. It felt strange having breathing room after years of constant financial stress. 3 weeks and 2 days after my attorney filed the dismissal motion, she called me while I was grocery shopping. The appeals court had dismissed Haley's appeal without even requiring us to file a response brief. They'd read the trial court record, looked at our motion, and decided the whole thing was so obviously frivolous that they weren't going to waste time on oral arguments or briefs. Even better, they'd awarded us additional attorney's fees plus $15,000 in sanctions against Haley personally for pursuing litigation that had no legal merit. My attorney was practically laughing when she explained that the appeals court had used language in their order that basically called out Haley for trying to abuse the legal system. I stood in the produce section holding a bag of apples and felt this wave of satisfaction that was almost scary in its intensity. 2 days later, my attorney forwarded me an email from Haley's lawyer. He was withdrawing from representing her, effective immediately. The email was professional, but you could read between the lines that he was done working for free on a case he'd now lost twice. My attorney said most contingency lawyers will stick with an appeal if they think there's any chance of winning, but this guy had clearly realized Haley had lied to him about her actual involvement in my company. I felt a grim sort of satisfaction knowing that Haley's attempt to steal from me was now costing her money instead of making her rich. She'd have to pay our attorney's fees from both the trial and the appeal, plus the sanctions from both courts. My attorney estimated it would be around $32,000 total, and she said she'd be aggressive about collecting it, because people needed to learn that friendship lawsuits have real consequences. The payment showed up in my attorney's trust account about 10 days later. She called to tell me the check had cleared, and she was processing the final distribution to cover our fees. She mentioned that the check had come from an account with both Haley's name and her father's name on it, which meant her parents had probably paid it since Haley definitely didn't have that kind of money sitting around. I thought about Haley's mom calling my mom to guilt trip her about breaking her daughter's heart, and now Haley's own parents knew exactly what she'd tried to do. They'd seen the court documents spelling out her claims, read the judge's rulings calling the lawsuit frivolous, and then written a check for $32,000 to cover the consequences of their daughter's greed. Over the next few weeks, several mutual friends reached out to tell me what Haley was saying about everything. Apparently, she'd been complaining that the legal system was rigged in favor of rich people, that judges sided with whoever had more money, that she never had a fair chance because I could afford better lawyers. The cognitive dissonance was almost impressive. She was literally trying to become rich off my work, demanding half of $12 million for doing nothing, and now she was playing victim about rich people having advantages. One friend told me Haley had posted something on social media about how the justice system protects wealth over relationships, and a bunch of people who didn't know the actual story had commented supportively. I didn't respond or engage because what was the point? The people who mattered knew the truth, and Haley could tell whatever story she needed to tell herself. I took some of my acquisition money and planned a vacation for the friends who'd actually supported me during the lawsuit. The 4 people who'd never questioned my side, who'd listened when I needed to vent, who'd reminded me I was doing the right thing when I felt guilty. I rented a beach house for a week, and we spent the time swimming and cooking and staying up late talking about everything except Haley. Nobody mentioned her name once the entire trip, which felt like the closure I needed. These were real friends who supported me without expecting anything in return, and spending time with them reminded me what actual friendship looked like. When I got back from the beach, my former tech investor called asking if I wanted to meet some other entrepreneurs he worked with. He'd been telling them about my story, both the business success and how I'd handled the lawsuit, and several people wanted to talk to me about their own early-stage companies. I started meeting with founders who were where I'd been 2 years ago, trying to figure out how to build something sustainable. I shared what I'd learned about product development, customer acquisition, team building, and how to protect yourself legally from people who might claim they deserve equity they didn't earn. Helping other people avoid my mistakes felt more meaningful than sitting around thinking about Haley's betrayal. One woman I advised was dealing with a friend who kept hinting that she deserved equity for emotional support, and I was able to walk her through exactly how to document everything and set clear boundaries before it turned into a legal mess. Watching her handle it proactively instead of reactively like I'd had to made me feel like something good had come from my experience. 6 months after the lawsuit officially ended, I ran into Haley at a coffee shop downtown. I was waiting for my order when I saw her walk in, and our eyes met for maybe 2 seconds before she literally turned around and walked back out. Part of me felt sad that our friendship had ended this way, that someone I'd known since middle school was now someone who couldn't even be in the same room as me. But mostly I felt relieved that I didn't have to pretend anymore. I didn't have to act like her minimal interest in my life had been real support, didn't have to downplay my own work to make her feel better about her choices, didn't have to maintain a friendship that had probably been one-sided for years before the lawsuit made it obvious. I grabbed my coffee and walked back to my car feeling lighter than I had in months. A couple weeks after that coffee shop moment, one of our mutual friends texted me saying she'd run into Haley at a networking event. Apparently, Haley spent the whole time talking about her plans to start her own business and how she was going to be way more successful than I ever was. My friend sent me this message like she expected me to be upset or threatened, but honestly, I just felt tired. I texted back that I genuinely hoped Haley did build something successful, because maybe the process of actually creating a company from scratch would teach her what real work looked like. Maybe she'd understand why her emotional support hadn't been worth $6 million if she had to spend 2 years teaching herself skills at night after working all day, or cold calling potential clients who hung up on her, or eating ramen for months to afford server costs. My friend responded with a bunch of question marks like she couldn't believe I wasn't mad, but I meant it. The best thing that could happen to Haley would be learning the difference between watching someone build something and actually building it yourself. I started thinking about what I wanted to do next with the acquisition money. After investor payouts and taxes, I had about $4 million to work with, which was enough to fund a new venture without needing outside capital right away. I kept coming back to agricultural technology because I'd spent 4 years building relationships with farms across 3 states, and I understood their problems better than most tech people did. The farmers I'd worked with dealt with so much inefficiency in their operations, from irrigation systems that wasted water to equipment that broke down constantly to supply chain issues that cost them money every season. I started sketching out ideas for a platform that would help farms optimize their resource usage using data analytics and sensors. Nothing fancy or complicated, just practical tools that would save them money and make their work easier. I reached out to some of the farm owners I'd gotten to know through my first company, asking if I could visit and talk about their biggest operational challenges. 3 of them invited me out within the first week, which felt like validation that I'd built real relationships during those early morning phone calls years ago. I drove out to a dairy farm about 2 hours away and spent the afternoon walking around with the owner while he explained his irrigation problems and showed me his equipment maintenance logs. He trusted me enough to share actual numbers about his costs and losses, which was exactly the kind of data I needed to build something useful. The work felt good in a way that had nothing to do with Haley or the lawsuit or any of that drama. This was just me doing what I was good at, identifying problems and figuring out solutions. A few days later, my attorney sent me a final letter officially closing out the case. She wrote that she was proud of me for standing up for myself and not backing down when Haley tried to intimidate me with legal threats. The letter said that too many people settle these friendship shakedown attempts because they feel guilty about their success, like they somehow owe other people a share of what they earned through their own work. She explained that fighting back the way I did protects everyone because it sets a precedent that you can't just demand money from successful people by claiming you provided emotional support. Her letter made me think about how many entrepreneurs probably face similar situations and just pay people off to make the problem go away. I wondered how many people had given money to friends or family members who felt entitled to their success, not because they actually deserved it, but because saying no felt too hard or too mean. My attorney ended the letter by saying I should be proud of myself for drawing clear boundaries and protecting my work, and that she hoped more people would follow my example. Reading that letter felt like permission to finally move on completely from the whole situation. I decided to write about the experience without naming Haley, or including any details that would identify her specifically. I focused on the lessons I'd learned about boundaries, about documenting everything in business relationships, about not letting guilt override common sense when people make unreasonable demands. And I wrote about how emotional support between friends is valuable and important, but it doesn't create any obligation to share business proceeds unless there was an actual agreement and actual work contribution. The post was pretty straightforward, just me sharing what happened and what I learned, but I published it on a few entrepreneur forums and subreddits where I thought it might help other people. Within 2 days, The post had thousands of views and hundreds of comments. My inbox filled up with messages from people telling me they'd dealt with almost identical situations, friends or family members who demanded money after they became successful. One woman told me her sister tried to claim ownership of her bakery because she'd taste-tested recipes during the development phase. Another person said their college roommate demanded equity in their software company because they'd let them complain about coding problems over beers. The stories were all slightly different, but the pattern was exactly the same. People who hadn't done the actual work feeling entitled to the rewards. Several people thanked me for writing about it because they'd felt alone in dealing with these situations and guilty for saying no to people they cared about. Reading all those messages made me realize how common this problem was and how few people talked about it openly. A week after the blog post went viral, I started getting emails from people asking if I'd speak at events about building businesses and handling difficult personal situations that come up when you become successful. A women's entrepreneurship group wanted me to talk at their monthly meeting. A startup incubator asked if I'd do a panel discussion about protecting yourself legally as a founder. A business school invited me to speak to their students about real-world challenges that don't get covered in classes. I said yes to all of them because I realized my experience, as painful as it had been, actually positioned me to help other people avoid similar problems or handle them better if they came up. The first speaking event was at a co-working space downtown, where about 30 women entrepreneurs gathered for the monthly meeting. I told my story without naming Haley, focusing on the specific steps I took to protect myself and the lessons I learned about documentation and boundaries. During the question period, almost every person had a story about someone in their life who felt entitled to their success. We ended up talking for an extra hour after the official meeting ended, everyone sharing experiences and advice. A journalist who'd been at that meeting contacted me a few days later, wanting to write an article about friendship breakups in business contexts. She said it was a topic that affected a lot of people, but rarely got serious coverage because everyone felt too guilty or embarrassed to talk about it publicly. I agreed to be interviewed anonymously, and she wrote this really thoughtful piece about how success can reveal the true nature of relationships that seemed solid before money got involved. The article quoted several entrepreneurs who dealt with friends demanding equity or payment for minimal contributions, and it helped normalize the conversation in a way that made people feel less alone. The journalist sent me the published article, and I read through all the comments, which were mostly people sharing their own stories or thanking her for covering the topic. Through the speaking events and the article responses, I connected with a group of about 8 women entrepreneurs who'd all dealt with people from their past demanding money after they became successful. We started meeting monthly for coffee, creating an informal support network where we could talk honestly about the challenges of success without anyone judging us for setting boundaries or protecting our work. Meeting with these women made me realize how common this pattern was, especially for women who'd been socialized our whole lives to prioritize relationships and accommodate other people's feelings over our own needs. We talked about how hard it was to say no to friends or family members, even when their demands were completely unreasonable, and how much guilt we carried for choosing our work over relationships that turned out to be conditional anyway. My new company started gaining some real traction as I developed the agricultural technology platform. I had working prototypes of the sensor systems, and I'd signed agreements with 5 farms to test the platform over the next growing season. But this time around, I was much more careful about who I discussed the business with and how much detail I shared. I'd learned that not everyone deserves access to your dreams and plans, even people you care about, because some people will use that information against you later, or feel entitled to your success just because they knew about it early. I kept my circle small and only talked specifics with people who had actual expertise to contribute or skin in the game through investment or partnership. One afternoon, I got a message on LinkedIn from someone who said they used to work with Haley at her marketing firm. The message explained that Haley had been fired a few months ago for repeatedly taking credit for work other people did, claiming she'd led projects she barely contributed to, and putting her name on presentations other team members had created. The person said they'd seen my blog post and recognized the pattern immediately, and they wanted me to know that Haley's behavior with me wasn't an isolated incident, but part of how she operated in general. I sat there staring at that message for a long time, not feeling happy about Haley losing her job, but not surprised either. The pattern had always been there. I just hadn't wanted to see it clearly when we were friends. She'd always been quick to take credit and slow to do actual work, always ready to be in the photos celebrating success, but never around for the hard parts of building something. I thanked the person for reaching out and then closed LinkedIn, not wanting to think about Haley anymore. I took some of my acquisition money and started investing in other women-founded startups, wanting to support entrepreneurs who were actually doing the work and building real businesses. I wrote checks to a food delivery platform, a sustainable clothing brand, and a healthcare technology company, all founded by women who reminded me of myself a few years ago, working crazy hours and betting everything on their vision. Several of the founders told me that having an investor who understood the journey made a huge difference. someone who knew what it felt like to build something from nothing and didn't expect overnight results or easy answers. I started seeing a therapist about 3 months after the lawsuit ended, not because I felt broken, but because I wanted to understand what had happened and make sure I learned from it. The therapist's office was in a converted brownstone with soft gray walls and plants everywhere, and during our first session, I explained the whole situation with Haley from start to finish. The therapist listened without interrupting, and then asked me what I'd learned about myself through the experience. I thought about it for a minute before answering that I'd learned I could stand up for myself even when it cost me relationships, and that felt like a strength I didn't know I had. The therapist nodded and said that many people struggle their entire lives to set boundaries because they're afraid of being seen as selfish or mean. We spent the next several sessions talking about how the lawsuit, despite being painful, actually gave me clarity about who I am and what I value. I learned that protecting my work wasn't just about money, but about respecting the effort and sacrifice that went into building something real. The therapist helped me see that Haley's lawsuit was probably the clearest gift she could have given me because it forced me to stop pretending our friendship was something it wasn't. Around the same time, I reconnected with some friends from my waitressing days who'd seen me during the building phase. I met 3 of them for dinner at the same restaurant where we'd all worked together, and walking through the doors brought back memories of coming in for lunch shifts exhausted from coding all night. We sat at a booth in the back, and they asked about the company sale and the situation with Haley, which they'd heard about through mutual connections. I gave them the short version, and they all shook their heads saying they weren't surprised Haley had pulled something like that. One of them, Sarah, said she remembered how I used to bring my laptop to work and code during slow periods while Haley would come by for free appetizers and complain about her office job. Another friend mentioned that they'd always known I'd succeed because they saw the dedication and sacrifice firsthand, watching me work doubles to save money for server costs and skip staff drinks to go home and work on the app. Hearing their perspective made me realize that the people who actually witnessed my work never questioned what I'd earned. Only the people who saw the finished product thought success came easy. A year after the lawsuit ended, I was in a completely different place mentally and emotionally. I had stronger boundaries with everyone in my life, not just about business, but about my time and energy in general. I'd developed better judgment about people, learning to watch what they did rather than believing what they said. My confidence in handling difficult situations had grown because I'd faced the worst-case scenario of someone I loved trying to destroy me, and I'd survived it. I looked at my life and saw that I'd built something real again with the new company, but this time I was surrounded by people who actually contributed, rather than people who just wanted to be associated with success. The difference was obvious in every interaction, from how my team communicated to how investors engaged with the business. I started each day feeling grateful for the clarity the lawsuit had given me, rather than bitter about what I'd lost. My new company raised a significant seed round 6 months into development, bringing in $2 million from a group of investors who did serious research before committing. During the final pitch meeting, one of the lead investors mentioned that they'd looked into the Haley situation as part of their background check on me. I felt my stomach drop thinking this might hurt the deal, but the investor said it actually gave them more confidence in my leadership. He explained that how I handled the lawsuit demonstrated character and business judgment, showing I could make hard decisions and protect company assets even under emotional pressure. Another investor added that too many founders let personal relationships cloud their business sense, and my willingness to fight a frivolous lawsuit rather than just paying to make it go away showed the kind of backbone they wanted in a CEO. The lead investor said they'd seen plenty of successful first-time founders who struggled with their second venture because they got soft or lost their edge, but my track record showed I was getting sharper and more focused. We closed the round 2 weeks later, and I used part of the money to hire my first employees for the new venture. I was deliberate about building a healthy company culture from the start, learning from both the successes and mistakes of my first company. I interviewed candidates carefully, asking about their work style and what kind of environment helped them do their best work. I hired 5 people in the first wave, all of them experienced in agricultural technology or software development, and I made sure each person understood exactly what they were signing up for. During the offer process, I shared equity appropriately with people who actually contributed, giving each early employee a meaningful stake in the company based on their role and expected impact. Setting up the equity structure felt like reclaiming the concept from Haley's distortion of it, proving that sharing ownership made sense when people actually built something together. My new team started work in a small office space near the university, and within the first month I could tell we had something special based on how people collaborated and pushed each other to do better work. One afternoon I got coffee with one of the mutual friends who'd stayed neutral during the lawsuit, and she mentioned that Haley had moved to a different city about 6 months ago. The friend said Haley seemed to be doing okay based on her social media, working at a new company and posting pictures of her apartment and new neighborhood. I felt genuinely neutral hearing the update, not happy or sad or curious about details. I told my friend I hoped Haley was happy, but I had no desire to reconnect or know more about her life. The friend nodded and said she understood, then changed the subject to talk about her own work situation. Walking back to my office after coffee, I realized that true healing wasn't about forgiving Haley or understanding her perspective. It was about reaching a place where she simply didn't matter to my life anymore. I spoke at a conference about building sustainable businesses 3 months later, presenting to a room of about 200 entrepreneurs and investors. My talk focused on the practical challenges of scaling agricultural technology and the importance of building real relationships with farmers, rather than just treating them as data points. During the question session, someone in the back row asked how I dealt with the friendship lawsuit they'd read about in the business press. The room got quiet, and I could feel everyone leaning forward waiting for my answer. I said honestly that it was painful but necessary, and that protecting your work isn't selfish even when people try to make you feel guilty about it. I explained that the lawsuit taught me to document everything and be clear about who contributes what, which made me a better business partner and leader. The person who asked nodded, and several other people came up afterward to share their own stories of friends or family members who felt entitled to their success. My mom called me a few weeks after the conference and said she wanted to talk about something that had been on her mind. We met for lunch at a place near her house, and she told me she was proud of how I handled everything with Haley. She admitted that initially she thought I should just give Haley some money to preserve the friendship, maybe $50,000 or $100,000 to avoid the legal battle and keep the peace. I asked what changed her mind, and she said that watching the lawsuit unfold made her understand that the friendship was already broken, and Haley's legal action just made it visible. My mom said she'd been thinking about all the times over the years when Haley made everything about herself, and she realized the pattern had always been there, but we'd all excused it because that's what you do with old friends. She said she was sorry for initially pressuring me to settle, and that she understood now why I fought back. I started mentoring a young entrepreneur named Jessica, who reached out through a mutual connection asking for advice. We met at a coffee shop, and she explained that her best friend from college was demanding equity in the business Jessica had built, claiming she deserved ownership because she'd been supportive during the early days. The situation was so similar to mine that I almost laughed, but instead I asked Jessica to walk me through exactly what her friend had contributed versus what Jessica had done herself. Jessica listed out all her own work, and then admitted her friend had basically just listened to her talk about the business occasionally while they hung out. I gave her concrete advice about documentation, showing her how to compile evidence of her actual solo work and her friend's lack of contribution. I explained the importance of boundaries and not letting guilt override business sense, sharing specific examples from my own experience with Haley. Jessica left the meeting looking relieved and determined, and 3 weeks later she texted me that she'd offered her friend nothing, and the friend had backed down after seeing the documentation. Helping her avoid my mistakes felt meaningful in a way that surprised me. 2 years after the acquisition, my new company was thriving with 15 employees, partnerships with over 100 farms, and revenue that exceeded our projections. I was surrounded by people who actually supported my work, rather than just wanting to benefit from it, people who showed up early and stayed late because they believed in what we were building. I'd built a professional network based on mutual respect and genuine contribution, where people helped each other because they valued the relationship, not because they expected a payout. Looking at my team during our weekly meeting, I felt grateful for the hard lessons I'd learned with Haley, because they taught me to recognize real support versus performative friendship. My life was fuller and more successful than it had been before the lawsuit, not despite what happened with Haley, but partly because of it. I went 3 months without thinking about Haley at all, which surprised me when I realized it. She came up during a mentorship call with a young founder who was dealing with a similar situation, and I had to actually pause to remember the details of what happened. The whole thing felt like something that happened to a different version of me, someone younger and less sure of herself. I shared the story with this founder as a cautionary tale about documentation and boundaries, using specific examples of what I did right and what I wish I'd done differently. She took notes and thanked me for being honest about how much it hurt at the time, and I realized that was true healing, turning pain into something useful for someone else. The lawsuit and the friendship ending still mattered in my story, but they didn't define me anymore or take up space in my head unless I deliberately brought them up to help someone. The email from the journalist came on a Tuesday morning asking if I'd be willing to be profiled for a major business publication. My new company had hit some impressive milestones, and they wanted to feature me in their emerging entrepreneur section. I said yes and spent an hour on the phone walking through my journey from waitressing to my first exit to building this second company. The journalist asked about challenges and setbacks, and I mentioned the difficulty of the acquisition process and learning to scale quickly, but the Haley situation never came up. When the article published 2 weeks later, it mentioned my previous successful exit in one sentence as background context, focusing instead on my current work in agricultural technology and my approach to building sustainable businesses. The whole piece was about my work, my vision, my team, the problems we were solving. No drama, no betrayal, no lawsuits. Just a founder who built something valuable, sold it, and was building something new. I sent the article to my mom, and she texted back 3 heart emojis and said she was proud of how far I'd come. I booked a solo trip to Iceland for the week of my company anniversary. 3 years since I'd started building that first app in my tiny apartment while working double shifts. I wanted to do something meaningful to mark the occasion, something that was just for me. I spent 5 days hiking through volcanic landscapes and soaking in hot springs, thinking about everything that happened in those 3 years. The early mornings cold calling farms, the rejection from restaurants who thought the idea wouldn't work, the first time I saw my app actually save someone money. The investor meeting that changed everything, hiring my first employee, watching the business grow beyond what I'd imagined. Then the acquisition offer, Haley showing up with her lawyer, the lawsuit, the appeals, finally winning. Starting over with this new company, building a team I trusted, learning from my mistakes. The journey included betrayal and loss, moments where I questioned everything, times I wanted to give up. But it also taught me strength I didn't know I had, showed me how to protect my work, helped me understand the difference between real support and people who just wanted to benefit from my success. I came back from that trip feeling settled in a way I hadn't before, grateful for all of it, even the hard parts. Sitting in my office 6 months later looking at photos from that Iceland trip on my wall, I thought about Haley for the first time in weeks. I was grateful I'd offered her exactly what she gave me, which was nothing, because it forced both of us to be honest about what our friendship actually was. She wanted credit for my work without doing the work, wanted to benefit from my success without supporting the struggle, wanted half of something she never helped build. Fighting back instead of giving in to guilt taught me to set boundaries and protect what I created. I lost a friendship, but I kept my integrity and my self-respect. Now I was surrounded by people who genuinely supported me, who showed up when things were hard, not just when things were successful, who celebrated my wins without asking what they'd get out of it. My business partner, my team, my real friends, the mentors who gave me actual advice. These were the people who belonged in my life. The lawsuit cost me money and time and emotional energy, but it gave me clarity about who I was and what I valued. I built a life and a career on my own terms, with people who respected my work instead of trying to claim it as their own. And that's the takeaway for this one. I love when small stories remind us how much we can still learn. If this one made you pause and think, that's all I could hope for.